Here's a riddle. What people love strikes and protests, veer from the right to the left politically, and make some of the best wine in the world? Nope, not the French. The Chileans. Chile is arguably the crown jewel of Latin America, given its high quality of living and beautiful features. But it also has a troubling history of repression and violence. Chile has been a hotbed for political strife, and its motto, by reason or by force, is perfect for the country. Today, I will explain why. I'm going to break down Chile in 4 parts. First, an introduction, then going on to the coup, thirdly, indigenous realities, and fourth and finally, women's issues. First, for the introduction. Introduction. Let's look at Chile at a glance. Chile as a sovereign entity was founded on September 18th of 1810 as one in a string of Bolivarian revolutions that swept through South America. Today, 18 million people call Chile home, making it the 7th most populous Latin American nation and the 6th most populous South American nation. Its current president is Sebastián Piñera of the National Renewal Party, who followed predecessor Michelle Bachelet of the Socialist Party. Chile is a constitutional democracy. Chile here is highlighted in yellow on this map of the southern portion of South America, and its miles of coastline, along with impressive length, make it a valuable yet complex country to govern. Here is a brief timeline of Chile's modern past. Keep in mind, this barely scratches the surface. 1535. Indigenous people resist the first Spanish invasion of Chile. Then, 6 years later, in 1541, Pedro de Valdivia began the Spanish conquest and founded Santiago, which is the capital of Chile. In 1810, a junta in Santiago proclaimed autonomy for Chile following the overthrow of the King of Spain by Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1927, General Carlos Ibáñez del Campo seized power and established a dictatorship. This will become a theme. In 1948 to 1958, the Communist Party was banned. This will also become a theme throughout that century. Then in 1970, Salvador Allende became the world's first democratically elected Marxist president. But not for long, because in 1973, General Augusto Pinochet ousted Allende in a CIA-sponsored coup d'etat. Then in 1988, General Pinochet lost a referendum on whether he would remain in power following 15 years of brutal dictatorship. Moving forward, in 1989 and 1990, General Pinochet stepped down in 1990 as the head of state, but remained commander-in-chief of the army, quote-unquote. And then in 1998, General Pinochet finally retired from the army and was made senator for life. In 2002, Pinochet resigned from his post as a lifelong senator. Then 2 years later, in 2004, Chileans gained the right to divorce, despite opposition from the Roman Catholic Church. In 2006, Michelle Bachelet won the second round of presidential elections to become Chile's first female president. And then in 2010, in February, hundreds died and widespread damage was caused by a massive earthquake that struck central Chile. And in 2011, thousands of students took to the streets to demand a more equal education system. Now moving on to the infamous coup d'etat. It's essential to go over this event to lay the groundwork for understanding Chile today, including how it has affected women and indigenous people. The coup beginnings. After the democratic election of the left-wing populist, pictured here, for Chilean President Salvador Allende, U.S. President Nixon lamented that he feared, quote-unquote, Chile would become another Cuba. In the years following Allende's 1970 election, Nixon actively supported his right-wing opponents through material and intellectual aid. He dealt even harder blows to Allende by cutting off financial assistance to the then economically vulnerable nation and quietly funneling that aid money to organizations that were critical of Allende. The coup, taking root. Nixon, being vehemently opposed to a left-wing government in Chile, mobilized the CIA to oust Allende through direct engagement with like-minded Chilean military officials. Using CIA-provided funds and supplies, the group attempted to kidnap strict constitutionalist General Rene Schneider, knowing that he would be against any overthrow of the democratically elected government. And in this attempt would ultimately end with Schneider shot dead and subsequent resistance towards a takeover by the Chilean public. Here is a newspaper headline from when Schneider died. The coup taking root. After the fallout stemming from the death of General Schneider, the CIA took a backseat to internal strife in Chile, though it remained evident that the state's position was anti-Allende. Just 3 years after Allende's presidency initiated, as I mentioned before, General Augusto Pinochet led a successful coup to displace him on September 11th of 1973, which was lauded behind American closed doors because Pinochet was regarded as a right-wing hardliner and allied with American interests in Latin America during the Cold War. The CIA again denied any involvement in the matter, though some argue the organization directly aided and abetted Pinochet. Now for some pictures. Here's some photos of the coup as it happened. On the left, you have a young man blindfolded being led through the streets by soldiers loyal to Pinochet. And then on the right, there's a still on the top of an explosion in Santiago, which we'll get to a little more in a moment. And then on the bottom, you have a young man being led through the streets at gunpoint, again by a soldier who is loyal to Pinochet. Here is a video without audio of some of the carnage that greeted ordinary Chileans on September 11th of 1973. In the words of the Chilean writer Isabel Allende, quote, "Before the military coup in Chile, we had the idea that military coups happened in banana republics, somewhere in Central America. It would never happen in Chile. Chile was such a solid democracy. And when it happened, it had brutal characteristics." End quote. Allende was right. Thousands were rounded up and executed in the National Stadium during the coup by the very soldiers meant to be protecting them. Even foreign nationals weren't safe, with Americans, Argentinians, Cubans, and Europeans going missing. Overall, about 3,000 people were killed under Pinochet, and more than 1,000 are still missing. He would never be fully convicted for the extent of his ruthless and power-hungry acts, and the wounds inflicted by his regime remain today. Here's a quote that puts this whole era in perspective, including the Cold War and how it affected Latin America, in which General Pinochet said, quote, "Everything I did, all my actions, all of the problems I had, I dedicate to God and to Chile, because I kept Chile from becoming communist." End quote. Finally, moving on. Now I'm going to delve into the original people of Chile, its indigenous population. Most Chileans today are of primarily European descent, with some to negligible indigenous heritage or none at all. This is due to European immigration throughout the 1800s and 1900s that was encouraged by the government through policy. That doesn't mean its indigenous people have dissolved, though. While indigenous Chileans may not be as visible as their counterparts in Bolivia or Central America, where they hold a lot of higher positions, they still have, or rather, they just have more visibility. They still have a robust history and presence in Chile today. Pre-20th century. The Mapuche are an indigenous group of people found in Chile today that have been there for hundreds of years. They were once famed for defeating the Inca and retaining control over their own lands. They were greatly affected by colonization, though, and most of their land was seized. Many individuals were coerced into converting to Catholicism, and still more died at the hands of disease and conflict, like many other indigenous people in the Americas. And then the 1990s. In the 1990s, following the fall of the fascist Pinochet dictatorship and return of democracy, indigenous peoples in Chile started to demand the return of their ancestral lands. Keep in mind that under Pinochet, indigenous people often felt the brunt of his right-wing dictatorship's aggressions because they were seen as sympathetic to Marxist causes and populism. Houses belonging to farmers and loggers were intentionally burned or occupied by Mapuche groups in an effort to pressure the government and private companies to reappropriate land back to them. Pictured here is a man protesting in the 1990s for just that. 2000s. In 2009, the government under President Michelle Bachelet had vowed not to seize lands in order to quell Mapuche protests, which had at that time escalated into more violence on both sides. Mapuche activists utilized radical tactics such as arson and rock throwing, while several activists were killed at the hands of police. Here is a man protesting in the 2000s. The 2010s. During activist hunger strikes, following activist hunger strikes, consistent protests, and more arson attacks, heightened violence erupted in 2013 when banks were attacked by masked men presumed to be Mapuche. Days later, a couple in the agricultural industry died in a house fire purportedly set by activists. Finally, in April of that year, a derailed freight train was attacked by armed activists. Though protests continue to this day, 2013 marks the last major escalation. The struggle for the retainment of land that once belonged to the Mapuche is mainly stagnant in the face of an apathetic government and public, which choose to focus on issues other than indigenous rights at this time. And finally, it's time to discuss women's issues in Chile today. While Chile tends to be ahead of other nations on most indicators of development, Chilean women have been relatively slow to gain rights and respect, ironically. Here are some numbers. In 2006, Chile elected its first female president, Michelle Bachelet, the daughter of a leftist persecuted under Pinochet. Chilean females' literacy rate almost matches that of males, though only 52% of females are employed. College-educated women often choose not to pursue careers in favor of homemaking, a cultural footnote reflective of the country's strong Catholic identity that resounds to this day. In fact, Chile only legalized abortion last year, in 2017, and abortion is only legal in cases of rape, fatal danger to the mother's life, and severe fetal abnormalities. Back on the topic of employment, Chilean women in non-degree jobs make 20% less than their male counterparts, and women in degree jobs make an astounding 40% less. Keep in mind, Chile is considered one of the most developed nations in Latin America in many ways, including overall quality of life and GDP per capita, as mentioned earlier. Even so, 50% of Chilean women reported they had suffered spousal abuse in 2016, and it's difficult for most to leave their marriages due to the female unemployment and stigmatization of divorcees and single mothers, another symptom of the Catholic Church's influence in the country. Because of this, Chile is only ahead of 43 other countries on the Global Gender Gap Index, at 91st out of 144. That math's not right. Okay, anyway, moving on. These images show the color and passion Chileans have for a better life, a theme which was demonstrated throughout this presentation. It's no different for Chilean women, and as time progresses, so will they. On the left, we have a young woman dancing in the marketplace, and then on the top right is a protest for equality between the sexes in Chile. As you can see, women and men are protesting there, and on the bottom right, we have a coup era image of women together. Now I will end with a quote by President Michelle Bachelet. Quote, "We simply can no longer afford to deny the full potential of one half of the population. The world needs to tap into the talent and wisdom of women. The participation of women is needed now more than ever. May I add, by reason or by force."